come the wife and kids and me. It's a hot old dusty highway for a Dust Bowl refugee.
Woody Guthrie wrote very good songs, but he also was not a great singer. So that there was a sound, there was a Woody Guthrie sound, which was rough, which was raw. Now, most performers at that time were thought to have a good voice, a trained voice, a smooth voice. So Woody, and other folk singers, of course, but Woody in this case in particular, introduced the idea that you didn't have to sound good to be good. And so that's a very important thing with Bob Dylan, that he doesn't sound, and of course he puts on an accent. It doesn't sound like he's from Hibbing, Minnesota. So he wants to sound like he's from Oklahoma. You want people to think that you're from a folk or from a rural, let's say a rural background. It sounds like you have the Dust Bowl in your throat.
And Guthrie was not alone in documenting the everyday tragedies of the Dust Bowl experience. Californian writer John Steinbeck, whose work in the second half of the 1930s had begun to focus on the lives and the struggles of working-class Americans, achieved huge critical and commercial success with his novel The Grapes of Wrath. This Pulitzer Prize-winning book focused on the suffering of the protagonist Tom Joad and his family as they escaped the dust storms and poverty of Oklahoma, only to face exploitation and further hardship in California. Accused of being a work of communist propaganda by various outraged groups, it was nevertheless adapted for the big screen in 1940, the year after its first publication. And Guthrie was in the audience to witness what he claimed was the best picture he had ever seen. Shortly afterwards, he would immortalize Tom Joad in song.
Well, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, of course, was a huge hit, and Woody says, although this is not clear, that he went to the movie a number of times, the film, John Ford film, to write his song series.
Tom Joad got out of the old McAllister pen. There he got his parole. After 4 long years on a man-killing charge, Tom Joad come a-walking down the road, poor boy. Tom Joad come a-walking down the road.
People are fed up with the system that has destroyed the country and are looking for alternatives, economic alternatives, political, and cultural. So you have films about destitution, particularly the Warner Brothers films of the time. So it's all over the media, novels, and Steinbeck is only one of many, music. So yes, Woody and Steinbeck are connected directly. And of course, then that bridges over into Springsteen doing his own version of these Dust Bowl songs.
Springsteen's album, The Ghost of Tom Joad, released in 1995, was directly inspired by both Guthrie and John Ford's film of the Steinbeck novel. Although the influence of Guthrie had already been heard musically in the album Nebraska, this work explicitly drew historical and sonic parallels between the folk tradition and the humanist politics of the past, and Springsteen's position as a singer-songwriter in contemporary America.
You know, there's an interesting sort of hopscotch stepping stone quality to this. I mean, Springsteen knows the work of Dylan, which sort of leads him back to Guthrie. Guthrie leads him to Steinbeck, and then Steinbeck leads him back, into an old weird America, as it were. That one of the great things about Springsteen, like all great artists, is that they have an ability to sort of access the past, but also an ability to use the past. And there's never anything antiquarian about Springsteen's interest in any of this. The Ghost of Tom Joad is an utterly contemporary record of the 1990s and simultaneously an act of homage, to Steinbeck and to Guthrie and the world out of which they emerged.
Men walking along the railroad tracks, going someplace and there's no going back.
It's a strange fusion of liberal politics and populism in a way that he presents this record. It's called The Ghost of Tom Joad. The Ghost is a significant title, I think, because it's a modernisation of that whole Woody Guthrie ethic. What Springsteen is doing is not transposing himself into the 30s, but all the vocal style, the guitar work, the imagery, everything is very much redolent of the 30s. But it's the 30s transposed into the modern age. In 1947, 48, Guthrie wrote Deportees. That's very much in that record as well. It is about immigrants, and it is about the exploitation of immigrants. It's about the homeless. It's not quite the world of the Dust Bowl, but it's a modern Dust Bowl, if you will.
There's somebody fighting for a place to stay, a decent job or a helping hand. There's somebody struggling to be free with a ghost of old times love.
The album doesn't do anything for me because it's so self-consciously derivative. It's such a Woody Guthrie record. And like I said, I feel Bruce had something to say politically more than he had something to say musically with that record. And so I think he probably took that. There's too much Woody Guthrie and not enough Bruce Springsteen in that. He didn't make it his own enough for me, for my taste anyway. So I would say that to me that represents a danger of this kind of appropriation.
Whether or not Springsteen's reimagining of the approach of Guthrie or the characters of Steinbeck was successful, it placed his work in an even greater artistic context. Both American folk music and Steinbeck's humanist works belong to a heritage that stemmed from the founding fathers of the American artistic tradition, from Emerson, Thoreau, and in particular the democratic vision of Walt Whitman. And as his communitarian political stance became more impassioned and coherent over the years, Springsteen perhaps unwittingly became an inheritor of that tradition. A complex character who began his career in the publishing industry, by his 30s, Whitman had reinvented himself as a rough, rustic visionary, a man of the people who part-funded the publication of his first work, Leaves of Grass. This tome, which he spent his entire life revising and rewriting, became the first distinctly American epic poem. Whitman's work, using an idealized self as the subject and a boldly unconventional use of language, was a call to arms from a man blinded by the light, both a lyrical expression of one man's illumination and also a vision of every individual American as a distinctive and intrinsic part of a unique whole.
Certainly Whitman was committed right from the beginning to be the poet of democracy. This is what being American meant to him. So that his inclusiveness, he had to be very careful not to exclude anybody, not to exclude anything. And if I had his poetry memorized, I could recite long lists in which he tries to refer to absolutely every profession. He tries to refer to absolutely every ethnic and racial component. Then he cautions himself. He doesn't want to leave anybody out. So he goes into the upper classes and he goes into the commercial classes and the successful businessmen. It's not simply egalitarian working class or something like that. I tramp a perpetual journey. My signs are a rainproof coat and good shoes and a staff cut from the woods. No friend of mine takes his ease in my chair. I have no chair, nor church, nor philosophy. I lead no man to a dinner table or library or exchange, but each man and each woman of you I lead upon a knoll. My left hand hooks you round the waist, my right hand points to landscapes of continents and a plain public road. Not I nor anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it for yourself. If you were to ask an American to look closely at his fundamental values, whether he's always able to live up to them or not, he would certainly affirm that each individual has a kind of value, a kind of worth, a kind of dignity that's totally apart from the circumstances, the economic circumstances, social circumstances, or whatever. And I think this sort of American maybe we should just call it an aspiration, but it's one that most Americans would embrace, can be seen very fully realized in Whitman. And it's still very present in our art and in our music, in our literature. I think this fundamental sense of human dignity is an important part of what one might call the American artistic tradition.
Of course, at some level, there is something verging on the absurd, and the scholars spending too much time in the ivory tower to start talking about, Walt Whitman's influence on Bruce Springsteen. As far as I can tell, at least for much of his career, there was none, because, books were not really a big part of Bruce Springsteen's childhood. I mean, his encyclopedia was, Gary U.S. Bonds and Mitch Ryder and people like that. But I think what one can say is that there's a kind of system of values, a cultural milieu, a tradition that they really are very much a part of. And you can trace this from Whitman, into sort of, certainly people like Steinbeck, and then into rock music. And I think there's a couple of different parts of this. First of all, an insistence on a kind of democratic vision of life, that you pay attention to ordinary people, that you depict them, that you represent them. That's one. Two, that you don't simply do that, but you do that with in a vernacular language, that you give voice to them on their terms, not on yours, not on with some degree of detachment, but from their perspective. Whitman writes from the point of view of the slave, in Song of Myself. There's something audacious, it may be even something inappropriate about that at some level, of course, and yet at another level it is really a part and parcel of a fierce insistence on representing, in the most elemental sense of that term, the people.
And this notion of representing the people became essential to Springsteen's growing agenda. Not only did the ghost of Tom Joad explicitly position him within the left-wing folk tradition, but in the new millennium his politics became more prominent. In 2004, he participated in the Vote for Change tour, encouraging people to register and vote with an emphasis on the removal of controversial Republican President George W. Bush, while also performing at rallies as part of Democratic candidate John Kerry's campaign. And this musical activism aligned him with the most political elements of the folk protest movement, and in particular drew him to Pete Seeger. In many ways, this attraction to Seeger was almost inevitable, as Seeger was linked to a number of the artists already discussed. Having been saturated in traditional folk material while working at the Archive of American Folk Song, Seeger, who came from a family of professional musicians, began to perform publicly in 1940. In the same year, he attended the Steinbeck Committee to aid farm workers, and here met and befriended Woody Guthrie. In 1941, he formed his first folk ensemble, the Almanac Singers, a socialist group with an ever-changing lineup, including at times Guthrie and prominent activist and folk musician Sis Cunningham. Hounded by the American government during the 1940s for his Communist Party involvement, as the civil rights and anti-war movements gained momentum in the early 1960s, Seeger rose to prominence again as part of the folk revival. As a musician, he both composed and popularized a vast array of modern standards, and as a musical activist, his tireless work is unparalleled. And Seeger has remained a senior figure and a standard bearer for the folk movement up to the present day.
There are three giants to the influence and direction of folk music. Alan Lomax, as a collector, essentially, and promoter, Woody Guthrie, and Pete Seeger. Now, Pete Seeger did everything. He's an incredible musician. The number of albums that he has done are uncountable, probably well over 100, and still doing it today. So he just got a Grammy. He was a collector. He was steeped in traditional Southern music, black and white.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
He was the genius behind People's Songs Bulletin, putting out a newsletter of songs in it. He's still working with Sing Out magazine, which he helped start in 1950. And also, I should mention, he's written many, many books. He also went on a round-the-world trip for 1 year and began to record in Japan, in Africa, the Caribbean. And he was always interested in new styles and new instruments. So he's been fascinated with every kind of style. So it's partly his world vision that we're all one in the world, which fuels his peace orientation, certainly, but much more in that he's fascinated with everybody and everything.
I think someone like Pete Seeger only began to make sense to Bruce Springsteen later on in his life. I think that Seeger became important as a figure, as a musician and somebody who was rooted in a certain set of values and in a community. And I think Bruce took all that very seriously. Seeger also was somebody who desired to bring so much of all kinds of music to his audience. And I think Bruce sees himself that way as well, you know, that they're fans of everything. You know, they want to bring everything that they like, they think someone else will like. You know, there's that feeling, you know, it's a very democratic kind of impulse, you know. You don't get the sense Mick Jagger thinks that, like, you are just like him, you know, but as I think ultimately Bruce thinks that, and I think Pete Seeger thinks that. And it's like, well, if I like this kind of music, you know, you're liable to like it too. And that sense of connection, I think, is a lot of what Springsteen values about Seeger and why Seeger became an important figure to him.
Having played with Seeger at a 1996 Woody Guthrie tribute concert, shortly after the release of The Ghost of Tom Joad, Springsteen was subsequently asked to also contribute to a Seeger tribute, the album Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Nearly a decade later, Springsteen was joined by a group of diverse musicians at his farm in New Jersey to record the album We Shall Overcome, the Seeger Sessions. Comprising a collection of traditionals either recorded or popularized by the folk veteran. Unlike the Guthrie-inspired Tom Joad LP, this was a direct homage both to Seeger's musical legacy and his philosophy.
Having Springsteen do an album of traditional songs, calling it the Seeger Sessions, I think promotes part of Seeger's agenda, which is to keep these songs alive. And as somebody who is so popular and so commercial in that world, promoting these songs is a testament to Pete's influence. Folk songs are designed to be done differently every time. There's not one way to do it. So in this case, with the instrumentation that he brought together, and of course Bruce's voice, it's different. So it's traditional, it's derivative in a certain way based upon songs he heard from Seeger albums, and yet he has his own stamp, definitely. And particularly I think the instrumental work with these wonderful musicians.
I think it works incredibly well because there's a genuine exuberance and sense of liberation in both Springsteen's performance, musically and vocally. The sense of Seeger's socialism that, you know, this is music for everybody and everybody can play these records and everybody should sing along. I mean, Seeger always saw himself as a facilitator and entertainer who wanted people to sing. His great achievement, I think he said, is that one thing I can do is I can get people to sing along with me, and that was crucial.
Now, even if you never heard the song before, you could sing it with me. Could you just repeat after me? Try it. Oh, you got to walk that lonesome valley, that lonesome valley. Oh, you got to walk that lonesome valley.
The Springsteen of the Seeger sessions is kind of achieving the same thing. And I think it's significant that, you know, those players that are on it are not people that usually think, oh yeah, he's playing with him. I never heard of any of them, which is partly maybe down to my ignorance, but I don't think so. Those players weren't well known. It goes back to Seeger, it goes back to the world of hootenannies, where you got up on stage and you played along with whoever was there, and to use that cliche from later, you left your ego at the door. It didn't matter whether it was the top folk performer of the day or the bottom of the bill. When you got to a hootenanny, kind of everybody's equal and they're getting up on stage and playing along. It's almost like Springsteen tries to lose himself in the Seeger sessions, so he just becomes part of the band and one of the band, and you do get a sense that he's also enjoying it. The enjoyment comes through more than anything in those songs. And it's not so much he's controlling it, it's controlling him. And I think it's probably the most liberating record he ever did.
When they opened up the strap, I was young and full-zipped. Wanted some place to call my home. And so I made the raid, and I staked me out a place.
It took a mature Bruce Springsteen to do that. A Bruce Springsteen filled with the love of his music and doing a homage to the invisible republic, as Grail Marcus called it, the hidden America that Springsteen's talked about so much in interview. And I think a major thing here that should be brought in is that when he was younger, Springsteen didn't actually come out and publicly do anything that was particularly political. In his later career, of course, this is the opposite. And I think that the Seeger sessions was a kind of homage to all that, but also a kind of farewell. Now, I don't mean for a minute that Springsteen is not politically active anymore, if anything, the opposite. But what I mean is, because as a person, he continually comes out and says who he supports. He campaigns for people. He talks against people. He doesn't need to do it in his music. He doesn't need a Ghost of Tom Joad to point out what his worldview is, because he's on the stage saying, vote for this man, don't vote for this man. Which means, especially after the Seeger sessions, where he nailed every colour to the mast you can ever want, he's just free to play his music. And I think that in the last two albums, Magic, I think, is particularly effective, though Working on a Dream is not far behind it in my eyes. They're very different, but what they both share, and I think this is very important for the purposes of what we're talking about here, they both have a man at the top of his powers who has all of this, everything we've mentioned, inside him now, and he can bring it out with ease. Everything he's learned from all the different magnificent musicians we've mentioned, he can just bring out at ease. And I think it makes the last two albums a cornucopia of all that's good in Bruce Springsteen's music.
Springsteen is at heart an inheritor. One of the key things I think of him as having is a sense of loyalty. And that loyalty has taken different forms in his career. Sometimes that loyalty is in writing songs in a particular tradition or from a particular voice. Sometimes it's a matter of covering certain artists in a certain voice. But above all, that loyalty is a sense of love for the world out of which he emerged. That love is not blind, but that love has never been in question. And there's not too many performers in the history of popular music who have had it to the same degree in the same way that he has. People recognize and appreciate that love. And I think that that's what's going to be his own legacy, that of the good son.